Welcome everyone to today's webinar on asset-based recovery, how to put community at the center. Before we begin the webinar, we would like to start by acknowledging that we meet on Indigenous lands. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contribution and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Today's webinar is about putting community at the center of our recovery plans. Communities across the globe are starting to move from crisis to recovery in response to COVID-19. To recover from a pandemic or disaster, we need to build social capital in our communities. And one way to do this is through building an asset-based community development recovery plan. Asset recovery focuses on the assets that have emerged and or are already in the community and allow communities to be more resilient. This webinar will dive deeper into the discussion about asset-based community recovery framework and how might we think about recovery with an asset-based lens and put community at the center. We would love for you to join the conversation and use our hashtag and our Twitter handles to post what you find interesting and some great quotes and your thoughts about the webinar. This webinar is brought to you by our Citizens and Emergency Preparedness Community of Practice. And we would like to welcome Jonathan Massimi and Debra Jakubec to the webinar today. Debra is a team lead of the Abundant Community Edmonton. She was born in Edmonton and is passionate about community building and inclusion. Debra has 18 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, becoming an executive director of the HIV Edmonton and Edmonton Federation Community Leagues. And Debra is now working at the City of Edmonton as the Abundant Community Edmonton project manager. Jonathan is the supervisor of the community centers with the City of Kitchener. Jonathan has worked on a variety of neighborhood settings and is a seasoned ABCD, asset-based community development practitioner. In 2017, he completed his doctorate where he explored the relationship between ABCD and communities of faith. His supervisor was John McKnight. I also wanted to point out that the City of Kitchener and the City of Edmonton are both members of our Cities Deepening Community membership. And we also want to hear from you all on the call. So we are going to be using the chat box and we'll be posting 3 questions throughout the webinar. And I'm going to work as hard as I can to harvest the answers from that chat box and bring them into the conversation. If you have any specific questions regarding the framework or anything that you've heard today, please post them in the chat box or in the question and answer box. We are going to be harvesting the questions and doing a post email out with our answers to it. Just in case we don't quite get to them today, we're going to make sure that we can answer all the questions. So get your chat box open, your question and answer box open. You don't want to miss the inspiration and the good ideas that you're about to read and hear over the next 50 minutes. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for the introduction, Heather. Just to give a brief overview of this asset-based renewal framework. The conversation actually started virtually with Heather as we had our virtual coffee time set, which used to happen in person. And what we were noticing was that a lot of the frameworks that were being presented early on in the pandemic were very much focused on economic recovery and institutional type recovery. What wasn't being addressed, as we believe, was this element of social recovery. How do we work toward getting people connected and working together for the betterment of their community? Now, I don't know about you, but as things are starting to open, a lot of appointments that I had scheduled are now being rescheduled. And typically what happens is I get a reminder in my email and it says, your appointment at 1 is happening, but first do this self-assessment. So you have to think, okay, do I have these symptoms or that, or anything else. And this was also happening in the earlier days, this self-assessment to see if you had any COVID-19 symptoms. The way I understand this framework is it is somewhat of a self-assessment. Now, when we are attending to community, when we're attending to neighborhoods, I think an important aspect to begin tending to is ourselves. So in using this framework, there are some questions in each phase that we can begin to ask ourselves to help us realize where we are in these particular phases. As well, we can expand that discussion to friends and neighbors to see where they're at. Now, our desire is not for this framework to be linear. We can be experiencing these things at different times, in different places. Just because you're in a discovery phase does not mean that you will not experience crisis or vice versa. Now, in terms of the crisis, it's the importance of asking those questions. And within asset-based community development, there is that importance to enter into spaces with curiosity and not trying to enter these spaces with answers. So the asking of questions is very important. When organizing communities, asking people, what are your gifts? What are your skills? What are your interests? What are your stories of hope? And sitting back and listening and hearing one another. Now, what we found in the beginning of the crisis was, again, the focus was economic. And the thing that we did notice is in this moment of crisis, people were grasping and seeking toilet paper over reaching out and taking hold of their neighbors. Now, this economic focus, and there's the gentleman holding his toilet paper, that was worth a small fortune at the time. What I found happening in the crisis was as things began to close down, those with economic means were able to weather the storm initially a lot better than those that were financially struggling. To apply that to communities, we speak of something called social capital or a gifts economy. And the experience that I had is that those communities pre-pandemic that invested deeply in social capital and building that gifts economy were able to weather the crisis stage a lot better than others. With that, I leave it to Heather.
So we're going to watch a little clip about social capital. It's about 5 minutes, and it's a clip from the Great Disconnect movie. So can you play that, Rute?
When Simon Kuznets, who was one of the lead architects of the GDP in the 1930s, developed it, he said to the US Senate that it shouldn't be used as a measure of social progress. And yet that's exactly what we do. So what we're interested in is, how do you grow all those other things that matter? One way to think about it is that there's different forms of capital. So we talk about economic capital, and everybody thinks that capitalism is about economic capital. But the green or alternative economists would tell you that there's at least 3 other forms of capital. There's human capital. What are my assets, capacity, abilities? And collectively, what's our assets, capacities, and abilities? Then there's social capital, which is about how we interact with each other, the social networks that we build, the social systems that we build. And then there's natural capital, which is nature, the resources, the way our ecosystems function. In the 21st century, real capitalism is about building all 4 forms of capital at the same time. And we have a rather distorted version of capital that says that We're only going to grow economic capital, that's all that matters. In the process, we damage or destroy natural capital. We damage or destroy social capital. When you look at what's happened to the outsourcing of jobs, to the destruction of businesses, to the destruction of communities in the pursuit of economic capital, and then we harm individuals because we're harming human capital when we destroy social capital or natural capital. So we're growing one form of capital at the expense of the others. Well, I'm sorry, but that's very antiquated 19th century economic thinking. It doesn't work in the 21st century. And so real capitalism is about how do you simultaneously build human, social, natural, and economic capital. And if you can't do that, you're not a real capitalist in the 21st century.
So this is a snippet from a documentary, The Great Disconnect. And if you're interested in it, and if this was a little bit of a teaser, there are some opportunities for you to actually watch the whole documentary. And so Edmonton is doing one tonight. And Tamarack is hosting a movie night on August 18th. And so we'll make sure that in the post email, you get the links and the information you need to hear the rest of The Great Disconnect. So we'll go back to the recovery framework and Jonathan and Debra.
Right, so we are going to begin with the crisis stage, which is marked by activity, recreation, research, and connection. So in speaking of the crisis, this is in the article that is on the Tamarack site, and I believe was also sent out. Something that I noted, again, beginning with myself and seeing what was happening within me and around me, recognizing that when the crisis hit, there was a fury of activity, people rushing to stores, and an increase in entertainment, trying to forget about maybe even what's happening around us. And one of the lines that comes out of here is, in terms of activity, this incessant need to be doing and not to slow down and to reflect, because reality doesn't hit a moving target, right? And then the next was that element of recreation. We were very quick to recreate those on land connections. So we talk about coffees and concerts and parties, even worship. What quickly happened was those on land connections tried to move online. So we talked about having virtual coffees, virtual concerts, virtual hangouts, virtual worship. Then we moved into research, recognizing that uncertainty can lead to us doubting our own abilities, our own knowledge or direction. And when we doubt, we seek answers. So the answers we find were imparted to us by professionals, subject matter experts, and the media outlets. So our power to know was handed over to systems and institutions. And then also what's happening in this crisis was this sense of isolation and loneliness. And in that phase, I sought to connect with as many people as I could in a virtual manner. So the relationship building wasn't about depth, but was about breadth. And within this screen existence, we achieved somewhat of a transcendence. We were connected through wires, yet we were unable to take root in a place. And when that happens, our embodied community has the potential to wither. So within this crisis stage, it was very easy for a scarcity mindset to enter, where we felt that we did not have enough and that we looked to others, professionals, stores, entertainment to provide for us. And what this framework was looking at is how do we continue to hold on to our community power, begin to look at this situation through an abundance lens, and recognize the gifts and individuals who are the holders of those gifts that are around us, and bring those gifts into association, whereby together we are able to enter into discovery and later resurgence. So that was this a high level of on the crisis.
That's great, Jonathan. I'd like to add a little bit about crisis in Edmonton. So what you saw is a lot of the things I think we saw in Edmonton too. We really saw that, surge of activity. And I think a lot of people started out in the beginning thinking, how long will this last? And I think initially people thought it would just be a matter of a few weeks. I'm not sure everyone knew that it would last as long as it did. And then I know you and I chatted about this before. For Abundant Community Edmonton, which does block asset-based community development block level connection, we recreated ourselves by going online immediately, like I think a ton of people really did. And so in Edmonton, we really saw a lot of random acts of kindness in the beginning. So I think there's a little slide that kind of shows, it might be the next one, Rute, sorry. A lot of pictures of random acts of kindness. And so we saw some great examples of citizen-led solutions where the citizens went out and they created things that helped people who were really scrambling economically to find, in food security and things like that. So it was actually an organization called YAG, Community Response COVID-19. YAG stands for Edmonton. It's our airport calling number. So if you look at the picture on the left, it shows, food distribution in the park. So anybody could show up and grab something there. On the right, we see meals that were prepared for people to pick up. So really, like Jonathan said, people tried to move from scarcity where they were hoarding toilet paper to giving back to community and providing food. And the picture in the center is just my favorite. There's just a random bunch of carrots available for people to pick up. Quite quickly, we saw in Edmonton that this group had over 20,000 followers. So I think in the crisis, we saw people at first kind of froze and then reacted by trying to share with community. Was that similar for you in Kitchener, Jonathan?
What we were finding in Kitchener, and this is back to what we were talking about in the investment in social capital pre-pandemic, there were groups that did invest in those connections. And once the crisis hit, we're able to react to what was happening around them and maintain those connections. There's a wonderful group out of one of our community centers that continue to do a meal program and meeting the needs of individuals. Actually, Joanne D'Souza is on the call, so shout out to Joanne. And we're able to connect with 80 families and have given out today a couple of thousand meals delivered. And recognizing how that group was able to leverage those connections that they had made pre-pandemic. On the other extreme, I might not name anyone this time, we did have some larger associations that had a focus simply on programs. And when buildings started to close and people weren't able to gather, they found themselves in a holding pattern because their identity was predominantly the delivery of programs. And it's not to say that people weren't connected through the programs, but once the pandemic hit, the infrastructure was not in place to maintain those connections, because the primary means of connections was a Zumba class or a yoga or things like that. And once that was unable to happen, that began to become the issue. So what I see you experiencing in Edmonton, it was that this didn't just happen. I believe that the soil was already tilled pre-pandemic for these things to continue to grow and flourish, and for people to rely on one another at the beginning stages of COVID-19.
Yeah, definitely. The abundant community Edmonton neighborhoods that were connected continued their connection and checked in on each other, not leaving anyone behind. And then we saw people saying, I want to connect, but I can't. So that kind of happened.
Mm-hmm.
I posted a question in the chat box about what's one thing that stood out during the crisis, and so there's lots coming in there, and there were posts about emotions and the emotions that the crisis brought out: confusion and fear and division and state of panic. There's one here that I love, and Emily posted it, and so I'm just going to read it because it's one thing I actually didn't really think about. And it says, what stood out for me was that everything, especially the institutions that people rely on, whether it's village offices, provincial, federal offices, not-for-profits, all closed without warning and without any communication about whom to contact or how to get in touch. Just closed, gone. And it left people feeling abandoned, without information, and without connection, especially those in rural places. And to me, that is spot on. When I was trying to connect with the government about my social insurance number, and I spent 8 hours just on hold, and I never got it. My solution isn't actually, my problem is not even solved yet. And so I think that's really, it makes you pause, and especially in the community centers, and Debra, you in the city, that's sort of what happened. It just shut down, right? And then another one was about power struggles. So power struggles started coming out and showing and emerging during the crisis. Zoom fatigue, mental health wellness, and the lack of opportunities to engage. And then the last one, they're all good, and I'm going to harvest them, and because they're all good. But the last one was about the saturation of COVID news, and everything the news, everything was all about COVID, and everything else ceased to exist. And yet everything else still existed, and still things happened, but that the news didn't cover it. And so that was something that was another kind of aha moment for us. So any quick comments about what I just said as we move on to discovery?
I think this does lead into the discovery, something that Cormac Russell has said quite often. Things weren't getting worse; they're becoming clearer, and a lot of things became clear during this crisis. And when the institutional rug was pulled out from under us, we recognized those things that we did rely on, and possibly came to the recognition that, maybe some of those things we didn't really need because we're doing okay now, right? But definitely it happened very quickly, and the emotion, entered. Disorientation was another thing. The typical patterns that we once had were gone, and we're scrambling to create new patterns of being, not only in relation to our institutions, but through our connections with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo that for sure. We saw patterns. So the neighborhoods in Edmonton who were already connected continued their connection how they could, usually on phone or virtually through Nextdoor or through Facebook groups in their neighborhood. And then the other pattern we saw that we hoped to try to work with that large group that was doing amazing random acts of kindness is we really wanted to focus on more organized acts of kindness. So looking locally, how do we get everyone together to focus on building local connection and keeping things local? It didn't make sense to drive food from one side of the city to the other side of the city. How do we focus on local connection so we're actually building the social capital the video showed earlier? And I'm going to quote Cormac Russell too. We have to go beyond focusing on who's needy, but to everyone being needed. And so at the block level or even the neighborhood level, you can kind of do that. Everybody can contribute. On my block specifically, there's a lovely lady who couldn't go out because of suppression problems. But what she was able to do was to call everybody on the block every once in a while and check in on them. So that's kind of how we saw Edmonton really putting citizens at the center around how they dealt with the discovery of how they could do things.
I think that sets the stage for our discussion now on discovery. What was noted in the article was, so crisis, we had that activity and feeling of disorientation. What I found marked the beginning of discovery stage was fatigue. And people did mention the Zoom fatigue, and you're like, oh my goodness, how many more online yoga courses can I take? Can I do this forever? And recognizing that these patterns were not sustainable. And what I was realizing with the Zoom fatigue happening was people were at the very beginning, hey, who wants to do a virtual meetup? Everyone would say yes. And slowly as it progressed, people were dropping off. And there was a greater desire to, rather than look at relational breadth, people were moving toward relational depth and only connected with a smaller group of people. And we saw those even happening in my own community, the driveway meetups, maintaining social distance, pulling up in parking lots, people talking to each other out of their cars. I also saw an increase in that. Also an increase in confidence. People recognizing that in this time of discovery, things were being revealed about themselves. Not only the things that they missed, but also the gifts that were emerging. During the discovery, so I would say crisis entering into the discovery, I was amazed how many people knew how to bake bread by the end of the crisis. And everyone was trying out new things and going back to musical instruments and getting involved in more hobbies, and recognizing that those gifts within themselves, not only to do these things, but the power they had even to occupy themselves without looking outside of their particular circles to do that. So within the discovery stage, it noted that new patterns emerge, connections, deeper connections were sought, and a confidence begins to emerge to say, yes, we can do this.
I really loved how you brought up confidence, Jonathan, because I really think, and we saw a lot of people who maybe they had a little bit more time on their hands, but in the past they hadn't wanted to be involved in a bunny community Edmonton. And so without becoming official block connectors, they started to get out there, and they just kind of naturally emerged. So we saw a lot of people who just kind of emerged naturally to say, I'm going to do stuff on my block and make this a great place to be. We're all stuck at home. And, they started putting pictures up on the window, and they had, throughout the whole neighborhood, they'd have like little bears one day, so you could walk around and see all the little bears. The next day it'd be a flower motif. So I think it was part of keeping kids busy, but it was also, really for something for people to do to feel connected, even though they probably couldn't connect in the ways they were used to. We saw a lot of sharing and exchanging of goods and services in the safest way they could, like the sourdough starter. And we saw a lot of buy nothing groups start up, because we all knew that everyone was kind of still, while they were sharing things and being giving, they really wanted to ensure that they were looking after their own economic welfare. We even had people, because the city in Edmonton had held back for a while with taking care of some green spaces, people coming out and doing that. So what I think is, we saw sometimes people who went from really being residents who consume things, but as citizens who participated a little bit more in the well-being of others.
Yeah. Another thing that I also discovered was that even in our world, we're very much built on a caste system. It became even clearer about the disparity within segments of our community. And in that, and we'll talk about it in the Resurgence, became very, very clear. There were those that were forgotten and were willfully sacrificed for our economic well-being, and put in places where they could have contracted, and some did contract the virus. Specifically, I'm thinking, and there's a group home near my house, which I discovered for youth with cognitive and physical disabilities. And I said, I wonder what's happening in there. And I'm now in the pattern of driving by and walking by that place to see what activity is actually happening. I'm in the process of reaching out to that group to see what are things that they would need for support, as well as what gifts are present in that community that can be offered to the community as a whole. What I'm learning in this discovery stage is, we're not saying institutions take a hike. There are places where an institution can offer support, but I think those areas need to be identified by the community. But what I am learning is the importance of the grassroots or the ground up type of development. But also, when we think about the ground up, we also need to look at from the outside in. Who are those on the margins? Who are those that have been forgotten during this time? And as essential gift holders in this community, how do we begin to bring people that have been forgotten into the center and begin to celebrate them and their gifts?
Mm-hmm. There's it's there, and we're working with L'Arche in Stratford, L'Arche, and it was funny because way back when all of this happened, I checked in with them, and I think we were still in the crisis, and they were already moving to the discovery because they were thinking about the patterns and the connections, and they realized that that they over connected people in a person-to-person way, and not prime them and not prime them, but not help them to connect in a virtual way. And so the only connection they did was face-to-face. And so this really hit them because they didn't have that balance between face-to-face, and that they realized that connections to people were really important during this time. And so they in crisis were already starting to think of this discovery and looking at the patterns and the connections, and they were confident in saying that they're not going to go back to the same programming they did, which was, I think, was very advanced in terms of their thinking. Now that we've had lots of great stuff coming out on the question that I asked was, one thing you discovered about yourself. And it's funny because I figured, I was like, there's going to be somebody in there to say I'm an introvert, and I loved it because the introverts really like this. And I found that I'm an extrovert, but I actually think there was an introvert that was hiding in me, because I'm really enjoying this pause, this time of being just with my family and not connecting and having to be so overly connected. But there were about the importance of social connection, the staying at home and slowing down, that whole pausing, the reflection piece came out. And then there was two that I want to highlight, and it's kind of, Leanne says, frustrated with unintentional movements, not physical, but in systems. And then Kat wrote, a lot of our community efforts in the UK were stolen by the systems, especially images and comms. And so that I found very interesting. And Jonathan, you talked about systems and the role of institutions, and how some institutions went too far in terms of doing for, instead of kind of doing that, stepping back and supporting community. So we're going to move on to the Resurgence, and what is our hope?
right. So as Heather mentioned, Resurgence is, the feeling is marked by hope, which in turn inspires action. So it's this reclamation of a community's power, and it's this conscious step toward addressing and working with what has been revealed. And it's here that we recognize gifts, we foster connections, and we tell stories. And again, we continue to ask questions. And in this resurgence stage, there's 5 questions in terms of the self-assessment and community assessment that we can do. And the first is, in what ways has your connection with others energized you? So think about those times you were able to connect with people. Where did you find energy, and what were those times that really drained you? Second, what has changed during this time that you don't want to lose? So whatever happened, not all of it was bad. There were certain things that we can continue to carry forward that have been revealed, or practices that have been enabled that can help us in this resurgent stage. Third question is, what are things you needed that you wish you had that the community can now provide? So when everything was pulled out from under us, we'd say, okay, well, I wish this was in place. And one of the things that I recognize in this time, one of the things I wish I had in place was contact information for my neighbors outside of Facebook, because not everyone was on Facebook or Twitter, etc. And it would be nice to have that. So as things are beginning to open up a bit, that's something that I'm slowly starting to do, and try to get a hold of a neighbor's contact information so that we can connect. Then again, that revelation piece, what challenges have been revealed that you feel need to be addressed? And then what capacities have been revealed or strengthened that could assist in addressing these challenges? So again, the reclamation of that power to say, what do I have, or what do we have collectively to slowly begin to address these things that have been revealed. And it is that conscious step toward reclaiming the community's power, because as things start to ease up, and as people start to frequent stores and are out in the community, there is that I'm going to say danger to return to default to what we remember. And I think sometimes communities can experience a selective amnesia, where they'll block out all these things and try to go back to the glimpse of a memory that they once had, and trying to recreate it again in this time. So when I talk about discovery toward resurgence, I do say to communities, and also to myself, try not to slip back into that default. What have you learned? Take this very mindful pause before stepping forward in engaging with one another, or even the starting of initiatives. So saying, what have I learned about myself? What have I learned about the community? What are some things that have arisen? And now what do we have collectively to address it?
Yeah, that's great, Jonathan. I love how you talk about connecting your own block, and how you saw that as being really important to you as a person, rather than an employee. And so we've been talking about how at Abundant Community Edmonton, we can better connect blocks for the future. And we've been thinking about future crisis, right? To build relationship, because we've talked about this framework you guys have created being really an iterative kind of thing. We might go back into crisis, and it's not always that big, COVID-19 crisis. It could be a neighbor breaking their leg, right? And we need to rally around and maybe get meals for that neighbor, or help that neighbor get to the physician after a while. So we want to look, we're thinking now a little bit about reimagining how things happen, which I see similar to Resurgence, and how relationships can be built post-pandemic, so the neighbor will be there for people when we have even the little mini crisis. And I think we pulled together a bunch of folks who have pretty strongly connected blocks and neighbors. And we asked them a little bit about, what do you see about, post-COVID? And some of the things they talked about is they want to talk a little bit, how do we stop, keep, change and reimagine things. So there are some things we want to stop doing maybe. There's some things we want to keep doing that might be new. There might be things we want to change because of what we experienced. And then how do we reimagine the future of our neighborhoods? And so the slide that just came up now talks a little bit about Abundant Community Edmonton and the books that we have that are really formal. The work we do is much less formal. I'll put a link in the chat about it. But I do think when we're looking at resurgence and these questions that you guys have that are great, that I'll share definitely with our ACE neighborhoods. When we think about reimagining, the city of Edmonton's hoping to do that, and I really hope we're putting citizens at the center of that whenever we can, and thinking about how do we reimagine going forward when we know that especially nonprofits, any organization and any municipality will be facing some interesting economic challenges over the next while.
There's a lot of studies out there. The one that I just recently read, and the Citizens and Emergency Preparedness Community of Practice group about a year ago, we talked about it, and it was a study done in Chicago during a heat wave. And they looked at 2 different communities, and the reason why I'm saying this is because there was a post here about the pandemic and the push for basic income, and how the pandemic has affected those in lower income. And what they found though was that the communities, one was a lower income community, they actually were able to survive the heat wave because they had this sense of community and they worked together. They knew their neighbors, and they supported each other. And the other community was more of an affluent community that didn't know each other. And so it really just shows that in terms of the looking at post-pandemic, knowing that this is not going to go away. It's here to stay, whether it's COVID or some other disease that pops up, is that it really comes down to the community and supporting the community. And another comment in the group was the role of local government and community leadership. And this goes back to those 3 questions on what can community do for themselves, what can community do that they need some support with, and what can't community do that outside agencies and organizations and government can do. And so when you're looking at this and thinking of those questions, and Jonathan, you talked about this, about those on the outskirts, supporting community doing this, not doing the pandemic planning for the community. Could you comment on that?
So I think the question that you mentioned at the very beginning was the how might we? Yeah. How might we put community back at the center? And I think an important thing within that question to define is the we. So if as institutions, we say, well, how might we as institutions put, or systems or service providers put community back at the center? I think if the we is defined as institutions, the answer to that, a starting point, I believe, can be, how do we relinquish our power? How do we hand over elements of what we do back to the community? And back to those 3 questions that you mentioned, Heather. What can a community do for themselves as the first level? Second, what can a community do for themselves with outside help? So that the community itself determines where it needs assistance. And then finally, what can't a community do that by itself but requires outside help? And oftentimes, I've been in the service provision game before going to the city, and as institutions, we typically begin with that 3rd question: what can't the community do for itself? And we start there. And in beginning with that question, then we begin to label, and we slip into a scarcity mindset, where we end up doing 2 people and 4 people rather than thinking of what Cormac says, with people and by people. Now, again, back to that defining of the we. If we is the community itself, the question there we need to focus on is, how can we hold on to our power and our influence? And a term I love to quote Peter Block: how do we become architects of our own future? How do we set up and create the communities that we want to live in and be proud of and thrive in?
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm currently reading a book called Places for the People, and I'll put the link in there. And it seems funny because this book was published I think 3 years ago, but I was reading it with today's lens, and I was thinking, wow, did this guy know this was happening? Because it talks about social infrastructure. And when the hurricane hit in New York, they used the social infrastructure to bring people out, and they created these valleys, but when a storm hits, those valleys become reservoirs. And so I was thinking, how can we, with a COVID lens and the resurgence and, kind of reclaim the community power, how can we rebuild or build community where we build social infrastructure so that we don't have to close our parks, so we don't have to close our community centers and our libraries? So how do we rebuild our social infrastructure so that people can still get out and be with each other? But when a pandemic happens and we can't be close to each other, that those social infrastructures don't shut down. Like that one comment where everything shut down, we were left hanging.
is this the book you're referencing?
Mine, I think, is an older edition. The front looks different, but
Palaces for the People. So
yeah, that's great. Heather, I think something we missed chatting a little bit about. I thought of it when Jonathan was speaking about crisis and what we do when we're in crisis mode, and we shouldn't forget that most often when there is a crisis on your block or in your town or in your city, citizens are the first responders, right? It's not a first responder who's the first responder. If something happens and there's an ice storm like we saw in Quebec a long time ago, the people who went out and checked on their neighbors were the first responders and there's evidence of that, I think, in Japan with the Kobe earthquakes, that when the earthquake happened, it was really your neighbors who got to you first. So I think it's an important thing. Oh, and someone just mentioned Cormac's new book.
That I'm so glad because I just finished the Places for People, and now I'm reading Cormac's book again with today's lens on it. And Cormac's book is basically, I think it's 10 years too late. If we had Cormac's book 10 years ago, we might be in a different way of thinking here. But it's actually, I've only read the first 2 chapters, and in it is about helping institutions to take that step back and what is your role in the building the community piece. And I actually just secured Cormac Russell to do a webinar with us on his book. And so I'm reading it because I'm going to go through with a fine-tooth comb, and we're going to talk about it in September and bring it to light. So I will make sure you all get that, the link to that piece. So we only have a few more minutes left. Jonathan and Debra, can you kind of leave the group with 2 or 3 ways that institutions and organizations can move forward? Who wants to go first?
Are you looking at me, Jonathan? I can go first with a little bit of.
Sure. Go ahead. I'll riff off what you have to say.
See what I can think of. I mean, I really think it's when they think about things, putting on the citizen lens. So I go to the term GBH plus, right? Global inclusion, right? GBA plus, which is that intersectionality lens. So intersectionality and looking at citizens first. How can citizens fit into this and what we're doing? Anything that's happening in the future is going to be a little bit more resource constrained, but it doesn't have to come from a scarcity model. So I think putting citizens at the center, trying to see how we can make things happen together. That's the first one I want to offer up. Jonathan?
something that I've been hammering away at for the last little bit is the importance of connectorship over leadership. So the leader is the one at the front of the room. The connector is the one in the midst of the community. Or John McKnight always says, if you want to find the connectors, don't look up front, but look at those mingling in the party. So I think that's something that institutions can do as well, rather than trying to lead everything. Be the broker, connect the gifts in the community. And once those gifts are connected, then lay off. It's not to say that institutions can't be catalysts for change. They can get something started, but recognizing the limits to what they can do. And once those limits are hit, ease off. I'm not saying that institutions shouldn't be on the road with the other cars, but I think we need to learn how to stay in our lane and allow the community to take the lead. And there's ways we can do that. But I think the beginning needs to begin with a lot of questions and asking, where are the gifts? Where are the passions? Where are the interests? And where are the stories? And I think one of the major things is when I work in communities, let me hear the stories. Where are those times where you work together, whereby you achieve the positive end with your neighbors? And I know John says this all the time, institutions work in statistics and communities work in the realm of stories. So how can we harness those stories as a means of inspiring?
And that just reminds me of a story, and I've heard this several times from John McKnight, about a mayor in a small town in Quebec. And that mayor, some of the residents came to him and said, we've got an issue. People are putting holes in the nets and our fish are getting through. And instead of saying, okay, you know what, leave it with me, we will fix the problem, he said, okay, well, what are some ideas that you have to be able to fix this problem? And they came up with a couple ideas. And then he says, okay, well, who can help you with these solutions? And they named some people, and he said, well, why don't you all of you come and meet in the chamber? And we'll have a meeting. And so they all came, and he said, listen, you know what, now you are an official group of the chamber and of council, and you're going to come and you're going to meet here in council, and you're going to report to the council about what you're doing and how you're solving the problem. And so that is really and I'm not probably doing justice to this story, but it just shows that instead of jumping to solutions, you ask and you listen to the community about ways that they can move forward. And then the way the mayor supported them was giving them a meeting space. How did the mayor also support them? By making them feel valued and making them feel that they are part of the process, because they are now a committee of council. And so if we can do that more as government and organizations, I think we could really get at that the community solves the problem.
Yeah, I really love what you're saying there, Heather. Two things I hope people do when they leave here is stand up and decide to connect their own block and find other people to join the neighboring movement, get to know your neighbors by name. Let's just do it on our own and make that happen. And secondly, I know it might be a hard sell now, but if municipalities will just invest a little bit of money in a couple people to support neighborhoods to do their own thing and support citizens to connect their blocks, but give them any resources they need, support. Sometimes it's just someone to talk to. I mean, that could go a long way to changing a town or a city. In smaller places, people tend to know their neighbors, but in bigger places, we don't. And I think we need to know each other and realize that we can help and rely on each other.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with both of you. In speaking about stories, one story for me personally that has framed my work is the years I worked at L'Arche Daybreak. So I was an assistant to a good friend of mine. His name's Peter. And he was an individual that was labeled, right? Autistic, Down syndrome, disabled. And on Friday nights, we would have prepare meals in this house where Peter lived. And this is when I first got married. We had just come back from a trip to Newfoundland. And my wife is from Newfoundland. I'm Italian, long story. She brought back some music from Newfoundland. And I was making lasagna, so talking about the bridging of cultures. And after we finished eating, we had a good old-fashioned kitchen party. And we pushed the tables aside, started playing the music, and people began to dance. And off in the corner was Peter. And I could tell he was sort of getting into it. And what my wife Erica did was grab Peter's hands and brought him to the center of this makeshift dance floor and began to dance with him. Now, at the end of the night, we would go to our Friday night service that would happen in Daybreak, and Peter's mom would come to pick him up, to bring him there, and he would communicate with his mother using this communication board. He'd spell out words and emotions. And in that moment, he shared with his mother, and this brought tears to his mother's eyes as well as to ours. He said, "I enjoy them much. I am dear to them." And I think in our work, how do we continually bring people on the outside to the center? How do we begin to value them and show them, and through our actions, our policies, our programs, that they are dear to us? And in that moment, it was not only us sharing the gift with Peter, but we were welcoming him to the center and welcoming his gifts, because in that moment, he was a gift to us. So I think, I was the paid professional there to assist him, but in turn, a space was opened where he was allowed to be himself and was welcomed and became the center of our activity. So that has been the means by which I've framed my work, and that's a story that I hold very close to my heart.
Thank you for that. We're coming near the end here, and the chat box is just exploding with lots of great stuff and ideas, and I think we've inspired many of them on the call to think about, stop, reflect, think about their recovery plans. And I think there is probably more. We're going to gather all the resources listed in here and some extras. I did post in there about the Abundant Community, Awakening the Power of Families and Neighborhoods. To me, that was a really good foundational book for me. And now I'm kind of making my way through other great books that are out there. And so if we can go put up the slide. I want to thank Jonathan and Debra for coming on here today and sharing their experiences of how they've put community at the center. The framework, I've put a link in the chat box to go to our website, the Cities Deepening Community website, to learn more about what we do. But there you'll also get lots of resources. You'll have access to the article there. And if you're interested in the membership that I talked about that Debra and Jonathan are part of, there is a brochure that talks about it. We would love for you to join our network. We have the Great Disconnect movie coming up next month, and then in September is a dive deep into Cormac Russell's new book, and we're going to have a great chat with Cormac Russell about that. And we have lots of community practices. So we have a neighbors leaders forum We have an ABCD community of practice and the Citizens and Emergency Preparedness community of practice, where we dive deep, and really it's your peers coming together to learn from each other. And so it's really just a space for you to share. And there was a lot of sharing happening on the chat box. And that's what we do in these community of practices. And other than that, we will be sending out the recording and any of the materials in the next few days. I think that's all we have. Thank you again, Jonathan and Deborah. I am so inspired and excited, and now I'm thinking about, now what? What can we do? How can we keep this conversation going? So stay tuned. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great day.